In the late 1970s, Iran looked like a country racing toward the future. Its cities were glowing with neon lights. Women walked the streets in modern clothes. Western music played on the radio, and oil money was pouring into the economy. Tehran felt more like a European capital than a Middle Eastern one. And yet, within just a few months, this same country would be burning with rage, filled with massive protests, religious slogans, and violent clashes. A powerful king would be forced to flee. A religious leader, once exiled and almost forgotten, would return as the voice of millions. And Iran, a close ally of the United States, would suddenly transform into one of its greatest enemies. How did this happen? How did a nation that seems so stable collapse into revolution almost overnight? To understand the Iranian Revolution of 1979, you have to look beyond the headlines and into the deep frustration, fear, and anger that had been building inside Iranian society for years. At the center of this story is Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the man who ruled Iran like a king and a modernizer at the same time. The Shah wanted to turn Iran into a powerful, wealthy, Western-style nation. With the support of the United States and massive oil profits, he built highways, factories, universities, and one of the strongest armies in the region. On the surface, Iran looked successful, but beneath that shiny surface, many Iranians felt trapped, ignored, and humiliated. Political freedom barely existed. Anyone who criticized the Shah could be arrested, tortured, or disappear at the hands of his secret police. The gap between the rich and the poor kept growing, and traditional religious communities felt that their values were being crushed by Western influence. While the elite lived in luxury, ordinary people struggled with rising prices, corruption, and a feeling that their country no longer belonged to them. Far away from Iran, living in exile, was a quiet but determined religious cleric named Ayatollah Ruhollah. He openly condemned the Shah for being a dictator and for allowing foreign powers, especially the United States, to control Iran's future. His speeches were banned inside Iran, but his words still spread secretly, copied onto cassette tapes, and passed from hand to hand. Slowly, his voice became the voice of the angry, the poor, and the deeply religious. By the time protests began to erupt across Iran in 1978, Khomeini had become a symbol of resistance. What started as small demonstrations would soon explode into a nationwide uprising, setting Iran on a path that would shock the world and change global politics forever. Under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, Iran was ruled like a kingdom wrapped in the image of modern progress. The Shah believed Iran could become a global power if it followed the Western model of development. With huge oil revenues, he built highways, luxury neighborhoods, universities, and one of the strongest armies in the Middle East. Women gained more rights, foreign companies flooded in, and Tehran began to look like a European capital. To outsiders, Iran appeared successful and stable. But inside the country, a very different reality existed. Political parties were crushed. The media was controlled, and anyone who criticized the Shah risked arrest or torture by his secret police. The wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while millions struggled with inflation and unemployment. Many religious Iranians felt that their traditions were being erased by Western culture. Mosques and clerics, once central to daily life, were pushed aside by the state. Over time, the Shah's push for modernization began to feel less like progress and more like a forced identity change. This deep resentment quietly grew beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. As dissatisfaction spread, Iran's religious leaders began to speak out more boldly. Among them was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric who openly criticized the Shah for his dictatorship and for allowing Western powers to dominate Iran. The Shah saw him as a dangerous threat and forced him into exile, first to Iraq and then to France. But exile only made Khomeini more powerful. His speeches were secretly recorded, copied onto cassette tapes, and smuggled back into Iran. In mosques, people gathered to listen to his words, which accused the Shah of corruption, injustice, and betrayal of Islamic values. At the same time, university students, workers, and intellectuals were also angry at the government's lack of freedom. Though their reasons were different, they shared one goal. The Shah had to go. This unlikely alliance between religious conservatives and modern activists created a powerful opposition movement. The government tried to silence it with arrests and censorship, but each act of repression only fueled more anger. By the late 1970s, resistance was no longer hidden. It was spreading through cities, schools, and workplaces, slowly becoming impossible to control. In 1978, Iran reached a breaking point. Protests that had once been small and scattered now grew into massive demonstrations across the country. Students, shopkeepers, workers, and religious followers poured into the streets, demanding an end to the Shah's rule. The government responded with force. Soldiers fired into crowds, killing instead of stopping the movement. This violence made it even stronger. In Iranian tradition, the dead are honored after 40 days, so every funeral became a new protest. Each protest created more deaths, and each death created another wave of demonstrations. This cycle spread like wildfire. Soon, strikes shut down factories, businesses, and even Iran's vital oil industry. Without oil money, the government began to weaken. The Shah looked more isolated every day. Internationally, his image as a strong leader started to crumble. Inside Iran, millions of people no longer feared him. The streets belonged to the protesters, not the government. What began as anger had turned into a full-blown revolution that could no longer be stopped. By the start of 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah was running out of options. The army was still powerful, but even many soldiers were unsure whether they should continue fighting their own people. The streets were constantly filled with protesters, and government buildings were being attacked. The economy was collapsing because of strikes, and daily life was becoming impossible. Even the United States, once the Shah's strongest supporter, began to distance itself, worried that his rule was no longer stable. On January 16, 1979, the Shah and his family quietly left Iran, officially saying it was a temporary trip. In reality, everyone knew it was the end. Crowds flooded the streets in celebration, tearing down statues and images of the Shah. For many Iranians, it felt like a great victory. A hated ruler was gone, and a new future seemed possible. People believed freedom, justice, and dignity were finally within reach. But the power vacuum left behind would soon be filled by someone else, and the revolution was far from over. On February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran after years in exile. Millions of people filled the streets to welcome him, seeing him as the hero of the revolution. His arrival was one of the largest public gatherings in history. Khomeini spoke with confidence and authority, promising to bring justice, independence, and an Islamic government that would protect the poor and the faithful. Very quickly, he became the most powerful figure in the country. While a temporary government tried to run Iran, real power was shifting toward Khomeini and his supporters. Revolutionary groups loyal to him took control of media, courts, and security forces. Anyone connected to the old regime was arrested or executed. Khomeini made it clear that this was not just a political revolution, but a religious one. Iran was not going back to a Western-style monarchy. It was moving toward an Islamic state. Many people who had protested the Shah now realized that a new kind of rule was replacing the old one, and it was just as strict in its own way. Within months of the Shah's fall, Iran was being transformed. A nationwide vote was held, and the country was officially declared an Islamic republic. Khomeini became the supreme leader, holding more power than any king ever had. A new constitution was written based on Islamic law. Political parties, journalists, and activists who disagreed were silenced. Women were forced to follow strict dress codes, and Western cultural influences were banned. What had begun as a movement for freedom became a system of religious control. Many Iranians who had fought against the Shah were shocked, but it was too late to turn back. The government was now backed by loyal religious militias and revolutionary courts. At the same time, anger toward the United States exploded, leading to the takeover of the American embassy and the hostage crisis. Iran was no longer just a new nation. It had become a symbol of resistance against the West. The revolution had completely reshaped Iranian society and its place in the world. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was not just a national event. It sent shockwaves across the entire world. For the first time, In modern history, a powerful Middle Eastern country had overthrown a Western-backed government and replaced it with a religious state. This inspired Islamist movements across the region and frightened many governments. Iran and the United States became bitter enemies, a rivalry that still shapes global politics today. The hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, and decades of sanctions all grew out of this moment. Inside Iran, the revolution created a society deeply divided between religious rule and the desire for personal freedom. Millions of Iranians still debate whether the revolution saved their country or trapped it in another form of control. What is certain is this: the events of 1979 changed the balance of power in the Middle East and created tensions that continue to affect the world. The story of the Iranian Revolution is not just about Iran. It is about how anger, faith, and politics can come together to change history forever. As the dust settled after the Iranian Revolution, one truth became clear: Iran was never going to be the same again. A king who once ruled with absolute power was gone, but in his place rose a system that would shape every part of Iranian life for generations. What began as a movement against dictatorship, corruption, and foreign influence turned into a religious state that redefined politics, culture, and identity in Iran. For millions, the revolution brought pride and independence. For others, it brought new restrictions and a different kind of control. But no matter how it is judged, the events of 1979 created a turning point that the world still feels today. From tense U.S.-Iran relations to ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, the shadow of the Iranian Revolution is everywhere. It is a reminder that when a nation's anger, faith, and hope collide, history can change in a single moment, and the consequences can last forever.